My name is Michael Burlingame. I'm the editor of this book, 16th President-in-Waiting, The Springfield Dispatches of Henry Villard, 1860-1861, and you are watching Author's Voice.
Sixteenth President-in-Waiting, Abraham Lincoln and the Springfield Dispatches of Henry Villard, 1860 to 1861. Southern Illinois University Press publishes it. We thank them for bringing our author here, 407 pages, and it's $45.50. I think I'm correct on that. Signed copies of The Green Monster, Abraham Lincoln a Life, are also available. That's $125 plus shipping. And well worth having it, by the way, on your shelf. Every essential Lincoln list is going to have that on it from here ad infinitum. I should tell you that The Sixth President-in-Waiting is the second book in a row that I've read where contemporaneous writing has propelled the story. The first one was just this week as well. Dan Abrams, Lincoln's Last Trial, has come out, where he used an original stenographic transcript to produce a narrative history of Lincoln's last murder trial in 1859, just before he was nominated for the presidency. And it'll be very soon on Author's Voice for our first off-site, live-to-tape interview. So look for that. That will be up very soon. This book really is Henry Villard's daily dispatches, which themselves tell a narrative story and narrative history. And if one pretends not to know the outcome, it's a very exciting You Are There book. So I want to ask you first, because it's right on top of me here, and I think the Lincoln community is going to want to know, in the dust jacket, did Villard ever notice that Lincoln grew a beard? And if not, then why did you use a dust jacket with German's February 9th, 1861 photo of him, especially since, as you say here in the book, Villard's dispatches from the inaugural train which he was on weren't used because others had used the same sort of stuff before it's redundant. So why a bearded Lincoln for the dust jacket?
Well, I'm reminded of a story about John Wayne. John Wayne was showing a friend in his private viewing room a movie that was about to come out starring him, and the friend kept looking at him as though this movie isn't really very good. And finally John Wayne turns to the guy and says, "I don't write this stuff, you know, and I don't design the covers."
I see. They didn't ask you, in other words. Well, at least it was of the period, but the late period for the dispatches for Villard. That's funny. Right. All right. Villard, Henry Villard. Who was he? And most people don't know who he was, yet here he is, an important figure for this book because it made this book. His dispatches are fascinating to hear. So what was his past and why was he in Springfield?
Well, Henry Villard was a German immigrant who became famous in American history as a railroad financier and builder. He built and financed the Northern Pacific Railroad. And his name lives on insofar as it's known by the American public through the Villard Mansion in New York, which had been the head of the Archbishop of New York would have his headquarters there, and today it's a very fancy upscale restaurant. And in any event, Henry Villard was a young German immigrant who had come to this country and had learned English very well, very soon. He and his father didn't get along very well, so he comes over here from Germany. He's very bright, very industrious, learns English he writes quite beautifully. And so he was a journalist, and he worked for German newspapers and some English language newspapers. He went to the Pikes Peak and covered that for the New York Herald. And the New York Herald, which was the largest selling paper in the country at that time, hired him to go out to Springfield because they liked his work that he had been doing on Pikes Peak and the like. and said, Lincoln's just been elected, go out and cover him every day. Tell us what's going on in Springfield. And he was the only journalist who had that assignment. There were other journalists who came along now and then for a brief period, but every day, practically every day, Henry Villard is writing dispatches back to the New York Herald and also to the Cincinnati Commercial, and then weekly or bi-weekly dispatches for the San Francisco Chronicle.
Was he acting as an AP reporter? Because, of course, by this time, the AP out east was getting stronger, and they were not especially giving to the Western press either, for that matter. Right. That's why the Western AP eventually came out. Right. So was he acting as that for many newspapers?
Well, at this point, newspapers were copying each other, and sometimes it was officially paid for, and sometimes it was just pirated. And so some of his stuff shows up partly through AP and partly through just pirating in other newspapers. But this was a chance for the public to know what Lincoln was doing, what he was thinking, day by day by day. It was the most intensive newspaper coverage that Lincoln ever had, because when Lincoln was president, you didn't have a White House press corps. You had people who would cover the White House and Congress and the departments and the military. And there might be 3 or 4 of them for a Washington bureau, but nobody was focusing just on the president every day.
Let me ask you this, because Villard was at the debates with Douglas, and he was really there as a Douglas supporter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe he was you might want to comment on this, maybe he was an early Michael Cohen giving money out to pay dirt, to find dirt on Lincoln.
Right.
But he was there, and Robert Hitt, the stenographer, was also there, and he took very copious, stenographic notes of the debates. So that's another time that someone really looked into Lincoln, is it not?
Yes, yes. Well, the debates, the fact that stenographic reporters covered the debates made it possible to have an accurate rendition of what both parties said. And Henry Villard in 1858 comes out as working for a Democratic German newspaper in New York and covers the debates. And he comes out and he meets up with Douglas, and he says, look, I really admire you. I would like to work for your campaign. And so he's both a journalist and an activist. Now, he doesn't tell you that in his memoirs. He says, I covered the Lincoln-Douglas debates for the German newspaper New York, but he doesn't say, I trashed Lincoln. And so,
when did the memoirs come out?
The memoirs came out in 1904, somewhere around there.
Okay.
So and they're very good. Those memoirs have some really good stuff in them.
But he's keeping, that's how he wants us to know of him.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so what I've included in the book is an appendix for the translation of these German articles where he covers Lincoln and Douglas, and he's very pro-Douglas. And then he's also working for Douglas. And this wasn't known. His biographers don't emphasize that, and it's not in his memoirs. He doesn't say, I was actually an activist. And he was giving speeches for Douglas. And you might think, and then he's got very positive coverage of Lincoln in these dispatches that I've collected in this volume. That he starts off a little skeptical, but then he quickly moves to become much more favorable.
Well, you say that he came, you said ahead of time we were talking, you say he came to Springfield to trash Lincoln.
Right. Well, we're not entirely sure that was the case, but he had a kind of attitude.
I was quoting you.
Right. Well, I'm not always accurate, so you know.
All right. We're historians and human historians. What can we do?
Well, that's right. My big Lincoln book, which is behind you here, is available online as well as in letterpress. And what I've done is to correct mistakes, which there were too many of, and add new material.
Has new material come in online that expands this greatly that people should go to?
I've drafted it, but I haven't actually gone through putting it online. But
well, let's sell these first.
Okay, right.
The print version, and then so if you want $125, great 2 volumes. This is it in a moment to get it.
Right. Now it's also available in paperback, so it's not. And I recommend people to get the paperback more than the hardback, because the paperback is safer.
What is a book dealer to do?
Well, you sell paperbacks, don't you?
No.
You don't?
Not
be sure to buy the hardback.
Yeah. You know what? Our clientele is very interested in collecting and in having editions that are signed and having a library that will continue on to the future. I don't mind paperbacks. Mm-hmm. And if it sells history and people get interested in history, I think that's great. But don't expect that library to mean anything later on.
Good point. Good point.
But nonetheless.
Okay. Well, I tell people that the paperback is safer because if you drop the paperback on your foot, you'll just bruise it. If you drop the hardback on your foot, you'll break it. So
that's very true.
Product safety is an important concern. And some people like to I don't know this is anathema here, but they like to read it on Kindle or iPad or the like. But I'm told that if you actually download my big book onto a device, that you should be aware that despite the laws of physics, as soon as you do that, your device suddenly becomes much heavier. So be forewarned.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Well, give us a quick overview of just what the press was. How did he fit into that? Here, an example, he was working for a democratic German newspaper.
Right.
Here in Chicago, the Illinois Stadtzeitung
Right.
was kind of abolitionist.
Right.
So the Germans weren't the same all over, and I guess the press representing those papers were not the same all over.
That's true. That's true. And the press in those days was very partisan. In those days.
Unlike TV today.
Oh, what? Huh? Yeah. So the journalists were oftentimes, in effect, agencies for the party that they were affiliated with. In fact, one of the problems with understanding Lincoln in the 1830s and 40s in his early political career is that there were no stenographic reporters. And so if you want to know what Lincoln was saying during these political campaigns, 1836, 1840, 42, and so on, you go to the newspapers, and all the Whig papers say Lincoln gave a great speech and everybody loved it, and the Democratic papers say Lincoln gave a terrible speech and everybody hated it. But you don't know what he said.
But even when we do know what they said, Douglas was very unhappy with Follett Foster when they produced the debates in 1860, and he even wrote a letter to them in the third edition stating how he didn't like how he was being portrayed, and they put it in and gave commentary on his right in that edition.
And which is ironic, too, because Douglas hired a stenographic reporter to come and misrepresent what Lincoln actually said, to make him look illiterate and not very articulate, and deliberately garbled what Lincoln was saying. And we know that because of the other stenographic reporters knew what this guy was doing.
So Douglas was on the wrong side of press history as well.
Oh, absolutely. And Lincoln bent over backwards to be fair about that, because he would take what Douglas said from the Democratic newspapers, and he would take what he said from the Republican newspapers, which is a very sensible and fair-minded way to do it. And when people debate the question of who won the debates, well, who was the guy who decided to have them published? It's a fair inference that he thinks that he won the debate, which I think is a reasonable conclusion.
And it helped win the presidency positively, so he's probably wrong. We talked about Villard and how he was there for Douglas in the debates, but when he came in the dispatches in your book here, he turns more favorably.
Absolutely.
How did he assess Lincoln's character when in the new book here?
Oh, well, in his dispatches, and by the way, there was an earlier edition of these dispatches that came out in 1941 that was edited by Villard's sons, and it's highlights from the New York Herald, which was the main newspaper for which he wrote, but it's just highlights. And there's an awful lot more information in the New York Herald dispatches that they actually wanted to do a new edition, the Sons, and the project fell through for some reason or other. But the Sons didn't know was that their father had written for the Cincinnati Commercial as well as for the San Francisco Daily Evening Bulletin. And I've included all of that in here. And there's a lot of new information that's not available in here that is available there. So if you're interested in what Lincoln was doing between the time he was elected and the time that he left 3 months later, it's a goldmine of information.
Thank God for the internet. So how did he then assess Lincoln in the debates, and did he change here?
He was trashing Lincoln in the debates, partly because he was a paid employee, and he quit after the third debate. He said right to Douglas, he says, "You hired me to trash Lincoln, and you haven't paid me. I'm going to go home." But he doesn't tell you that in his memoirs. And anyway, so he comes to admire Lincoln greatly as he gets to know him, and he speaks to him regularly. Now, one of the problems in the dispatches is he doesn't say, "Lincoln told me this," but there's an awful lot of indirect suggestion that, well, the climate of opinion around the State House is, and people say this. And we can infer, I think, that a lot of that is what Lincoln himself said, but it was thought to be discreet, not to directly quote him.
And some people, he claimed, you say in your book, that he thought he was scaring off would-be office seekers,
right, he did.
so that who didn't want to be seen as being there. Although I think everyone was ready; it didn't matter. The office was the seeking.
Well, but one of the things that this book illustrates is something that I've argued in earlier books that I've edited of journalistic accounts of Lincoln, is that Lincoln really used the press to get messages out. And one of the messages that Villard was sending is, don't come and pester Lincoln about patronage appointments, because if you do, I'm going to publish your name in the press, and you're going to look like a greedy office seeker, and this is going to embarrass you.
That was a porous sieve, wasn't it? I mean, they still came in droves.
Well, but they, at least if he's to be trusted, they were very embarrassed if their name showed up as greedy office seekers.
It's interesting. Lincoln is interesting, and that is how he uses everything that comes that's new, and he knows how to use it.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a telegraph,
Absolutely.
whether it's photography,
right.
or newspapers and
right.
the media.
Well, and Lincoln's use of newspapers is something that's not fully appreciated, because you didn't have press conferences in those days. You didn't have a White House press corps. And so what Lincoln would do in the pre-presidential period, and this is a prime example of it, is get his messages out indirectly by using a journalist to convey to the public what's on his mind, what he would like people to know. And now, as president, Lincoln was more direct about that. One of the more dramatic stories that I dug up was how Lincoln goes to John W. Forney, who was the publisher of the Philadelphia Press and the Washington Chronicle. And he says, Forney, I'm going to have to do something unpopular. We've captured these two leading pro-slavery advocates, senators, who are going off to Europe as Confederate diplomats, and the public is very enthusiastic about having this guys Mason and Slidell captured and thrown in jail. The British are going ballistic. They're threatening to go to war with us because of this, and we don't want to alienate the British, so we're going to have to let these guys go. The public is not going to like this. Would you please write some editorials to sort of soften the public's view? And Forney tells us this in '65. It's if in a rare publication I dug up. And in a way, that's what Lincoln is doing throughout here. One of the key things that everybody wanted to know between November of 1860 and February 61 is, how's Lincoln going to deal with secession? Well, here we have 7 Confederate states pulled out of the Union. How's he going to deal with this? Is he going to make compromises which basically give away the store, saying, oh, well, slavery expand. We can allow slavery expand. After all, we didn't really mean it when we make that the centerpiece of our party. And Lincoln, we know in private, is writing and saying, don't budge an inch on the compromise with slavery. We can compromise on some things, but slavery cannot expand. But in these dispatches, sometimes Lincoln shows that, well, maybe he can take a softer line. Now, he doesn't say that, but Villard hints at that. And I think Lincoln did that deliberately, to send a message of ambiguity. So right. that is he a hardliner? Is he a softliner? And so Lincoln was and Villard was a big help in this regard. And then
sending that ambiguity so he could
exactly,
do what he
right.
needed later on
exactly.
and decide as time
right.
went on, as facts went on. To me, that's one of his greatest traits, Lincoln, was thinking things out, coming to a conclusion, and sticking to it because he thinks he's correct on it.
Amen. Amen.
Of course, the Tea Partiers felt the same way. So I wonder, if Lincoln felt this and stuck with it, is he correct? And were they? That's a different story.
Right.
But nonetheless, so to me, it was nice that he kept the Union together. Not a bad thing that he helped end slavery, but not extending slavery into the territories was his red line.
Right.
How much pressure on him was there for that in his own party?
There was a great deal of pressure, saying that many Republicans regarded the South's threat to secede from the Union as a bluff, that they were intimidating the voters. And they'd done this in 1856. They'd done it back in 1850, 52. And so they said, don't believe these threats of secession. And then all of a sudden, secession really comes about. And so people are saying, oops, maybe we should be a little more accommodating, and maybe we shouldn't take a hard line on slavery extension. And Lincoln was saying, no, 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 no. And if it hadn't been for Lincoln's digging in his heels, it's entirely conceivable that some kind of concession would have been made on slavery, and that slavery could have existed a lot longer than it did.
Because I have a question coming in,
Oh,
I'm
sure.
going to go to this first about Mary Lincoln.
Yes.
I know that this is a subject that we could debate on
Right.
for a while.
Right.
But he grew not to like Mary Lincoln, like many others,
Right.
yesterday and today, in both Springfield and Washington, although he did call her plucky.
Right.
What was his gripe with her?
Well, he says that she allowed herself, and there's lots of evidence to support this, she allowed herself to be duped by flatterers, scoundrels who would give her gifts, they would praise her to the skies, and then they would say, would you help me get a job? Would you help my friend get a job? Would you help my friend get a contract? And so she became very corrupt. She engaged in all kinds of unethical practices. She accepted bribes, she accepted kickbacks, she sold cotton trading permits, she sold pardons, she engaged in all kinds of unethical, and Villard was aware of this and was scandalized by it.
Well, Angela from Germany. Thank you, Angela. Appreciate this.
Willkommen.
Exactly.
Ich werde versuchen,
3 questions came in. I'm going to go with your first one. In a note about the inauguration, Henry Villard describes Mr. Lincoln's fatigue with office seekers and mentions that even his wife, quote, meddled not only, whoops, I just lost it almost, meddled not only with the distribution of minor offices, but even with the assignment of places in the cabinet, unquote. Can you comment on what offices Mary Lincoln had her eyes on and what consequences might have occurred had she gotten her will?
Okay. So, vielen Dank für Ihre Frage. Also, ich werde versuchen, sie zu antworten. I know a little bit of German. Right. Thanks for your question. I'll try to answer it.
Yeah.
The most dramatic story is one that involves a gentleman who wanted to be the naval officer at the New York Customs House. And that was what the United States was financed. The federal budget was financed largely on tariffs and taxes on incoming goods. And the main port through which these came was, of course, New York. And so the head of the collector of customs and the naval officer and the naval agent were the 3 top offices. And you could make a fortune because not only you got a basic salary, but then you got a percentage of all the fines and levies and the like. And so it was a highly desirable set of offices. And so a gentleman named Isaac Henderson, who was the publisher of a New York newspaper, the New York Evening Post, aspired to have that job as the naval officer, where you make pots of money. And so he sends out a diamond brooch to a Springfield jeweler saying, give this to Mrs. Lincoln if she then makes sure that I get the job. On the day that Lincoln is to leave for Washington from Springfield, a German gentleman, Hermann Kreismann, comes down from Chicago. He was an operative for the Republican Party. And he comes down with Norman B. Judd, who was one of Lincoln's best political allies. And then Judd goes to become ambassador in Berlin, Prussia. He was called minister, not ambassador in those days. And Kreismann goes with him as his right-hand man. So here these guys come to Lincoln in Springfield, and they have an appointment. And Lincoln doesn't show up. And so they get concerned. So they go to see him, and they find that Mrs. Lincoln is having a fit. And the Lincolns are staying in a hotel at that time. They've left their house for a few days just before departure. And she's on the floor having a fit. And so Lincoln turns to Kreismann and says, she's not going to, until I agree to appoint her friend, she's not going to get up. And this guy then becomes the naval agent, actually, makes pots of money, and then is accused of all kinds of misdeeds. He's fired, he's tried, he gets off on a technicality, but he clearly had abused his power. So this was very embarrassing for Lincoln to have somebody like Henderson, who then in the middle of the Civil War gets arrested for kickbacks, and he insisted he wouldn't give any contracts or any of the like until he got a kickback. And that starts a pattern with several other people like that, who give Mrs. Lincoln gifts, and then she uses her influence to get them appointed to positions where they can make pots of money. And Lincoln goes along with it as his law partner said, he did a lot of things he didn't like to do in order to keep his wife's fingers out of his hair.
Well, let's go into the forming of the cabinet a bit more.
Okay, sure.
Was Simon Cameron the most difficult choice of the whole lot? And how did Villard look at that? I know that during the dispatches, as you're seeing it, he's giving predictions.
Right.
And, how was he in predicting the future as well? Because, for instance, he was thinking that the Treasury Secretary would come from New York.
Right.
And when he thought that someone was going to come out of Ohio, it was going to be Thomas Corwin,
Right.
and not whom it actually became.
Right.
So between his predictions and the Cameron brouhaha throughout the entire time, because he keeps coming up, tell me about the cabinet formation.
Okay, well, the selection of Cameron was the most difficult choice that Lincoln had to make, Secretary of War. And in an earlier book I did, was based on some interviews that had been conducted by Lincoln's principal White House Secretary, John G. Nicolay. And John G. Nicolay interviewed, 10 years after the assassination, a former congressman from Pennsylvania, Moorhead. And Moorhead comes out from Pennsylvania to lobby on behalf of Cameron. And Cameron had a somewhat questionable background and reputation. And so indeed he does, and justifiably. And so in this interview, we've got the notes in Nicolay's handwriting, and Nicolay says, or writes down that Moorhead says, well, would you please appoint Cameron? And then Lincoln's response is, all of a sudden, in shorthand, Nicolay's idiosyncratic shorthand. And I couldn't read it. And I showed it to some experts, and they said they couldn't read it. But I found one guy who could. And here's what Lincoln says. Lincoln says, I have just been elected largely on my reputation as honest old Abe. And how can I, as one of my first official acts, appoint a man to my cabinet whose name stinks in the nostrils of the American public for corruption? Oh, kaboom. Like, whoa.
Yet he did it.
And yet he did it. Why did he do it? Because Pennsylvania, well, there are two reasons. Pennsylvania is a very important state. It's the second biggest state in the Union. Lincoln realizes he's got to keep the Union together. You've got to keep the North together if you're going to, there might be a war, in which case you need Northern unity. You need Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania seems to be behind Cameron. Cameron got a lot of people in Pennsylvania to go to Lincoln and say, oh, please appoint Cameron to your cabinet. And why did they do it? Because Cameron said, if I go into the cabinet, you can have my Senate position. Mm-hmm. And then he says that to A, and to B, and to C, and to D, and they all go and tell Lincoln that
he was playing Rod Blagojevich here in Illinois?
in effect.
In effect. So how did Villard, he commented on everyone coming in and whom they were trying to represent, and he was also still predicting.
Yes.
So how did Villard come in on
He
this?
kept predicting that Lincoln was too moral. His standards of honesty and integrity were too high to allow him to appoint such a character as Simon Cameron to his cabinet. And Cameron turned out to be the most calamitous cabinet appointment he made. Another consideration is that at the nominating convention in Chicago, here in Chicago, in May of 1860, Lincoln's victory was largely a function of getting a huge surge of votes on the second ballot. And that surge was mostly from Pennsylvania. And Lincoln's campaign managers, particularly David Davis, told the Pennsylvanians, if you go for Lincoln on the second ballot, because they'd voted for Cameron as the favorite son on the first ballot, then Cameron will have a place in the cabinet. Now, there's some historical dispute about that, but to what I've discovered in my research is that it's pretty clear that they did promise that, and Lincoln felt obliged to honor the promises that were made in his name, even though he specifically told David Davis, make no promises in my name. And Davis says, Lincoln ain't here, he doesn't understand the pressures we're up against, and we're going to do it. So.
Well, that's politics, and it has to be done.
I was going to say.
I'm showing here a couple of cockades, one from Texas and one from North Carolina, and many Confederates during the secession period wore cockades such like this. You're seeing the Texas one right now. And Southerners did come up to see Lincoln.
Right.
And I was kind of surprised how many I was seeing in Villard's notes. One Mississippian came in. Angela, you and I had the exact same question about the Mississippian who came in and got assigned debates. Well, a Southerner came in and got assigned debates But who was he and where did that debates go? Do you know? I haven't looked in Leroy's book to see if it's in there.
I'm not sure. I don't know. But it's a very touching story. Here's this guy who's very flagrant and coming into the State House where Lincoln was holding audience, and with his big button that it says "I favor secession" in effect, and very defiant. So Lincoln then charms him and he does this with a lot of Southerners. The Southerners come thinking this is some kind of horned monster with a tail and cloven hooves. And Lincoln turns out to be a very agreeable, mild-mannered, reasonable fellow. And many of them come out and say, geez, if Southerners really knew what this guy's like, they wouldn't be so hot under the collar.
Well, Villard was reporting that he felt that maybe he was offering cabinet positions to some Southerners.
Well, Lincoln wanted to name some Southerners to the cabinet. And he wanted them not just from the border states, the 4 states that stayed loyal to the Union, slave states, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. And he does wind up naming somebody from Maryland and somebody from Missouri. Slave states, to be sure, but not the states that are likely to secede. And Lincoln explains, and Villard touches on this, that it would be very difficult for Lincoln to appoint somebody whose state then secedes, and then what's he going to do? Is he going to have to fire this guy and hire somebody new? And that would be untenable.
I'm going to read a quote from Villard himself.
Okay.
Because he speaks about all sorts of things, and we'll talk about some of these things, but all sorts of things, including autograph collectors.
Right.
And here is a Lincoln giving an autograph to someone as president-elect who had sent a letter and asked for it. And the last one, Matt. So what I'm asking, here's what Villard says. That popular mania, the collection of autographs of distinguished men, has proved of late a source of considerable annoyance to Mr. Lincoln. Also, and hardly a mail reaches here without bringing him numerous requests of specimens of his handwriting. Of course, all of them went unnoticed into his wastepaper basket. Well, no. As an autograph dealer for 46 years, I've handled bunches of them. Right. He was very attentive to people who were asking that. So where did Villard go wrong? Did he misjudge Lincoln?
Well, now, one of the things I try to do in the book is to identify the sources of information that Villard gets. Because he speaks to Lincoln a fair amount, but where else does he get it? And Villard is a young man from Germany. He's in his mid-20s. The principal White House secretary then is John G. Nicolay, also from Germany, slightly older, a few years older. And so I'm pretty sure that the information, much of the information that Villard gets is right from Lincoln's right-hand man, John G. Nicolay. And Nicolay probably told him that.
It's interesting because Nicolay himself wrote out the body of those most of the time.
Right.
It was very rare that Lincoln wrote out the entire thing. When he got to the presidency, he wrote out a couple there, but not so much in Springfield. So Nicolay was writing the body of that out the entire time.
Right, and we know that John Hay, who became Nicolay's assistant during the period that Lincoln's still in Springfield, and then becomes his assistant in the White House, that John Hay was very gifted at forging Lincoln's signature.
He did forge, and and a lot of my colleagues are selling them as Lincoln's. True. It's amazing. I've seen them and now know them, and you know them because you're in Springfield and see the Lincoln papers. And even after, I have one in my collection. I have a huge forgery collection, and in that I actually have a John Hay signed a Lincoln on a Lincoln CDV on a carte de visite photograph, and he gave that as real. Just within 2 weeks after the assassination.
Wow.
Really surprised me about John Hay. Kind of put me off for a while with him. Let's talk
interesting.
about presidential gifts, because
by all
gifts
means.
were coming in, and Villard talked about that as well. Probably the best presidential gift I've ever seen was a new Sears shovel that was given to LBJ. And with a note that says something to the effect of, you can't win the war, you can't lose the war, and you don't want to lose the war, here's a shovel to bury last week's dead. Well, that was probably the best I've ever seen of a gift. So tell us of some of the gifts that were coming to Lincoln. Were they bribery, just goodwill? How do you view it?
Well, the gifts that Lincoln himself received were mostly of no great value. But one fellow does an elaborate wooden chain of separate links, many links, and all out of one piece of wood. It's an astounding piece of carving. Then Lincoln would get wedges, like the wedges that you use to split a log. Rail splitting involves you don't take an axe and whack the log. You take a wedge, you insert the wedge, and then you take a big hammer, a maul it's called, and drive it through. And so you would get all these wedges and things of that sort. And people would come in and they'd say, are these the real wedges? And yes, and then Lincoln would say, yes, these are the real wedges that arrived yesterday. Not the ones he used 30 years earlier.
And Hanks at the end, after the assassination, turned them into real wedges.
Right.
I'm going to ask you this because someone has just come up to me this week saying that there's a rifle that they have. I forgot the exact type of rifle that they emailed and told me about that was given to Lincoln. Do you know of a rifle ever given to Lincoln? Maybe during the war, not at this area.
Not during the period of between his election and his inauguration that I'm aware of. But he
or during the presidency.
Well, during the presidency, inventors would come with rifles, and he would go out in the backyard, the south lawn of the Potomac, of the White House near the Potomac, and he would test fire them.
I can't wait to see the provenance of this, and I'll talk to you.
Well, I'd be very interested to know.
And let you know. You talked about Norman Judd before, and Matt, we have a letter of Lincoln. I had this just last year. Lincoln inviting Judd to be on the inaugural train. Mm-hmm. And of course, Villard was there as well. Will we see the dispatches on, just like you did with the Green Monster? Will you use a website to put things in that are not in this book, like all of his dispatches on the inaugural train itself?
One of the things I would like to do, which I haven't done, is to do that. And the reason I didn't include all those, first of all, this is a pretty big book.
Yes. Yeah. But it goes quickly. It's just a narrative history. Really, he's a wonderful writer, as you say, and you've put him together well.
Well, thank you.
Truth is my defense.
Well, and the reason I emphasize these more than the dispatches from the train is that there were several correspondents on the train. Mm-hmm. But he's the only guy who's day in and day out from November to February actually writing from. You get other people sort of visiting firemen, but it's not the same kind of intense coverage that's unique. Nobody else is doing this day in and day out. So what I'd like to do that, and then Villard goes on into Washington and does Washington dispatches about Lincoln. But there are lots of other people doing those too. But you're right, they should be collected, and they should be a kind of appendix to this, which I would put online. And online supplements to published volumes, I think, are great. Because for the Green Monster, for example, I have an online version which has much more full documentation and the like. And I think historians should do that. The head of the Harvard Library, a guy named Bob Darnton, said that really history books in the future and many other nonfiction books should be databases. That you'll have the top layer will be the book, what we would consider normally a letterpress book. The second layer would be the footnotes, which are oftentimes now in books or online or that. Right. And then the bottom layer would be all those documents. So you click from the footnote to the number, then you see it's a reference to a Lincoln letter, and then bam, you go and you see the Lincoln letter. So that, I think, is the future. And so one of the things that will make history more credible is that if you can go see the sources that the author used. Now, footnotes these days, you say, go see this book or this document in some obscure collection in South Dakota. Well, you're not going to go do that. But if you can have an image of it right there, it would be too expensive to publish that in letterpress form, but to have it as
perhaps a book will have in the front or rear board a screen.
Better
that
yet, yeah.
You can then read your book and then see on the screen everything that can't be published.
Wow.
Let's trademark that right now.
Right.
It came here first.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, don't steal it from me.
I won't.
So Nicole in Texas, thank you for watching and interacting with the question. Nicole asks, some political leaders who don't like what is written about them denounce the press in an attempt to discredit the whole institution.
Really?
W.T. Sherman, for example. Lincoln closed some newspapers. Did Lincoln appreciate the press and its role in democracy?
Well, Lincoln very much appreciated the press. And
thank you, Nicole.
Thank you indeed, Nicole. And newspapers were suppressed during Lincoln's administration, but not at his insistence. And when a general, particularly General Burnside, suppresses the Chicago Times, Lincoln says, no, you can't do that. Undo that so as quickly as possible. Then when the New York World gets suppressed for printing a false document, he says, no, we have to reestablish the paper. Don't shut it down. So Lincoln was not a great champion of press censorship. He didn't like press criticism. Who does? And there's a telling story where somebody comes, Mrs. Lincoln, I believe, has a collection of clippings from a hostile newspaper. I think it was, I can't remember which, but anyway. And Lincoln reads this up and throws it down, and it says, "Is thy servant a dog that you should do this?" But he never says that in public. One of the great things about Lincoln's leadership is that he didn't take criticism or disagreement personally. Yeah. And that is a huge advantage for a person in positions of power.
Or for anyone.
For anybody, indeed.
Just
indeed.
a character,
absolutely.
to have a character
absolutely.
that is
absolutely. And that
perfectly...
character, I argue, and I'm not alone in making this argument, that Lincoln's character is really the North's secret weapon. That the advantages of the North and the South, we don't have time to go through all that, but an odds maker in April of 1861 might have said the South's chances of victory are about 50-50. And a very distinguished historian, David Potter, argued a while back that if a man like Lincoln had been president of the South, and a man like Jefferson Davis, who quarreled with everybody, had been president of the North, the South probably would have won its independence. And Lincoln, when you see the kind of criticism that Lincoln had to put up with, and the contemptuous treatment that he received at the hands of people like Horace Greeley and George McClellan and all that, and he wouldn't take it personally, wouldn't quarrel. Amazing.
Well, since you spoke about Jeff Davis, I have a document here, a copy, there we go, that we also have that we can show you. This is the first and last page of January 15th. Jeff Davis et al. Writing to Isaac Hayne of South Carolina, who on this day, the 15th, was coming into Washington to do something about interference with South Carolina, and especially Fort Moultrie and Sumter and all of that.
Right.
This is an important piece, actually, so important that Jeff Davis put this into his memoirs. He wrote about it in 2 pages, and then he put the entire draft of it in the back of the memoirs. So was he aware, Lincoln, of what was happening in Washington and the machinations? Because Jeff Davis told Hayne in this, back off, we're forming a government. Then we'll do something about Charleston, etc. Mm-hmm. Was Lincoln aware of this? Was Villard aware of this?
Probably not. This was behind the scenes activity. But when Lincoln did receive suggestions from members of his own party saying, maybe we should accommodate these guys and compromise on slavery expansion, Lincoln was quite emphatic. No, no, no. With a chain of steel, resist any compromise on slavery expansion. We can give some ground on personal liberty laws and the like, but we can't give any ground on slavery expansion.
Now, Villard talks about outspokenness, mm-hmm. and that outspokenness is because of Richard Yates being governor, and he went to the inauguration. It was right there. Right. And he quoted Yates, "Outspokenness, although in reality a virtue, sometimes becomes a fault in public life, and such seems to be the case with the message of Governor Yates. Not that it contained a solitary fallacy, nay, only the truth, strongly and bitterly told." Then Villard disavowed Lincoln holding these views. And I'm able to state authoritatively that neither Mr. Lincoln nor any other political friend of Governor Yates saw or heard anything of his message before his delivery. Is this the obfuscation Lincoln needs to stay away from these sort of things?
Right.
And was Yates the Giuliani of his day? Was he out there for Lincoln?
Well,
I'm sorry about that.
It's hard to know just how much Lincoln knew about Yates's speech, and it seems unlikely that he went over it with a fine-tooth comb and told him, because Lincoln was suggesting to Republicans, don't go and use a tone of denunciation and the like to the South and slavery. That tone is as important as substance. So he was dismayed that the tone of Yates's speech was so belligerent, and urged Republicans not to use a belligerent tone.
There is a lot of other questions I really have about the book itself, but,
Okay.
but having you here, I cannot not ask some other questions
Sure,
as well.
by all means.
How would you assess the world of Lincolniana today in the studies, and how has the internet impacted it? And are there areas that remain untouched?
Oh, well, this is a great time to be a historian. In the old days, that is, back when I was doing my dissertation by candlelight, hand illuminating a manuscript like a medieval monk with white out and carbon paper and all that sort of index cards. The amount of research you could do depended a lot on whether you had money to travel, because the most important research is done in manuscript collections. And the manuscript collections that are relevant to Lincoln aren't just in Springfield and Washington, they're throughout the country. And so you've got to schlep around from one historical society and library and the like. And not all of it, but a lot of that's available online. And newspapers. Newspapers are a great underutilized source. And thank God for genealogists, because Genealogy Bank and newspapers.com and others exist primarily to meet the demand of genealogists. But we historians are lucky, but we follow in the wake of the genealogists. And there's so much more information that's available now through newspapers and all kinds of other sources, that the quality of research that one can do now is so much better than it used to be. So that I predict that as time goes by, the books on Lincoln and history in general will be more detailed, will be more accurate and more substantial. But that's one of the reasons I'm glad I can update the Green Monster, because I found a lot of new material on books that I'm now working on. I'm working on a book about the Lincoln marriage called Honest Abe, Dishonest Mary. You get the drift. I'm doing a book on Lincoln and African Americans. And one of the subjects, for example, Lincoln and African Americans, is nobody's really looked at how Lincoln reacted to individual African Americans who came to the White House with requests and suggestions and the like. And Lincoln was very cordial, and these people write about their experience. Everybody knows about Frederick Douglass, but there are all kinds of other African Americans that he reacts to: White House staff, then hospital wards, and all kinds of people. And this notion that Lincoln was a racist is preposterous. The cordiality, the openness that he demonstrates in dealings with individual African Americans is vastly underestimated. And I found a lot of good new information from newspapers.
Well, God, there's studies still to come in Lincoln. I'm
yeah.
glad to hear that. Hopefully they won't be out on Kindle. They'll be on something that you can sign.
Right, exactly.
Now look, everyone wants to see their own ancestors in a good light.
Right.
All of us. But in light of the controversy over Civil War statues and in the South, and as a self-avowed psychohistorian.
That's one word.
Yeah, exactly, one word. And I wrote it there, one word.
Okay.
How do modern Southerners come to grips with their ancestors' beliefs and actions?
Well, apropos of the whole uproar over the statues, and I'll get to that, but in this town, recently, I finally got to visit something I've been meaning to visit for a long time, and that's Stephen A. Douglas's grave and statue. And
Huge obelisk.
Right. And if there's anybody who was a race baiter, it was Stephen A. Douglas. He was flagrant in playing the race card. And his statue is in the South Side, with a lot of it's a big black population down around that. And I thought, when I went to see it, well, geez, if this is the first statue that should be attacked, I would guess, by spray painters or whatever. And it isn't. It's because he's up 60 feet high. And so I think all these other statues should be put up 60 feet high.
That's not a bad idea. I'd like to see it put in one big park.
Right.
But see, a difference to me is that Douglas's statue is where his house was and where Camp Douglas was.
Right.
It's an actual Civil War site.
Right.
And whereas the other statues are, I don't think most are attacking all the statues at Gettysburg or Antietam or anywhere
Well,
else.
they should be on battlefields or museums.
Exactly, and that's what Douglas's is, an outdoor
Right.
museum.
That's fair enough. And so I think that statues should be either in battlefields or museums.
Or way up.
Or way up. But as for Southerners, how they should feel about their ancestors, well, I sometimes ask my students this. They say, well, why should we respect people who were slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or like? And I say, well, how many of you eat meat? And they say, well, we all do. Well, what if 100 years from now everybody says that it's terrible, you don't have to eat meat, you don't have to kill all these poor animals, and would it be fair for them to look back on you as a kind of moral leper? Now, I don't mean to equate slavery and eating meat as one-to-one, but still the general idea is people's idea of what's moral and what's immoral evolve over time. It's conceivable now for 100 years from now, abortion will be thought of as infanticide, and no respectable person will support it. But is it fair for people who exist in 2018 to be regarded as moral lepers? Well, the Supreme Court and the like was in favor of it. So we have to use our historical imagination, put ourselves back in the shoes of the people who lived and the climate they existed in. So I think that's the best way to deal with that.
Now, we talked about character of Lincoln before.
Right.
And I've felt for a long time that if Lincoln is still going to be someone in the tricentennial of his birth, it's probably going to be for his character.
Yes, I agree.
And as an exemplar of ethics and how to comport oneself in many different areas of life. But that moral exemplar. Now, Lincoln College in Lincoln, Illinois, under the leadership of Ron Keller, has acquired the Abraham Lincoln Center for Character Development.
Right.
I think everyone should get online and look for that at Lincoln College. He just told me how he went out for fifth graders in Lincoln, and they all came together and they used Lincoln as that exemplar, wildly successful with both the kids, the teachers, and the parents. Mm-hmm. So he was telling me that there's something to this, and that's something I was advocating when I was down there myself on the board. And so how do you feel the tricentennial will be? How will he be remembered, admired? How?
Well, I would, as I suggest in the final paragraph of The Green Monster, I say that Lincoln speaks to us not just as the great emancipator or as the savior of the Union or as the vindicator of democracy, but he also speaks to us as a source of personal inspiration, that despite a childhood of emotional malnutrition, despite the early death of his mother, despite the estrangement from his father, despite the death of his beloved children, or two of them anyway, during his lifetime, despite his troubled marriage, despite his failures to win elections, some elections that he strove for quite vigorously, despite his setbacks, despite his midlife crisis, all this, he became a kind of moral model of moral righteousness, of integrity, and he can be an inspiration for not just the people that just people in our era, but for generations to come.
I like that. I'm glad we just videoed that. Today in the news, again, is suicide and depression. And with Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade, and
that's terrible. That's just terrible. Yeah.
You know, improbable to us. But I'm a son of a psychoanalyst, and my father had his office mate, one of his office mates, kill himself. So he knew that firsthand, and he would counsel his patients that you can always do that. He didn't take away their free will to do it. He said, you can always do that, but let's figure out something before that to try, so that you may not have to do that. You can get better and feel better about life and yourself. So that's something that I've inculcated into myself. Now, Lincoln, of course, had depressive tendencies throughout his life. And there were a couple of times where he may have wanted to commit suicide. His friends certainly felt that they had to take knives away from him, sharp objects. They were fearful for that. But I think that why he didn't was basically because deep within him is that idea that he didn't want to leave this mortal coil without doing something of note.
Right, exactly.
And so I feel that that's the reason he stepped away from doing himself in. But through you, what do you think we can learn through Lincoln and how to cope with depression? Do you have any thoughts on this, using Lincoln as an exemplar?
Well, the very fact that Lincoln did go through very profound, 2 episodes, as you mentioned. He had a predisposition to depression throughout his life, but on 2 occasions he was so depressed that, as you say, friends feared that he would commit suicide. And that Lincoln was able to go through that dark period and to emerge and to become the kind of moral model of integrity and wholeness, I think should be an inspiration. That even when you're going through what he went through and an awful lot of severe pain, and we know Lincoln writes about this, that he was able to overcome. It should be an inspiration to everybody else that you too can overcome depression and then go on to lead a very productive, and few people are going to be world historical figures, but they can be fulfilled doing things that are worthwhile and satisfying to them personally and to the larger world. So,
I have a last question before we have to end this. You know the George Robertson letter of August 15th of 58.
Yeah.
He was in Lexington, Kentucky. And Villard writes that Lincoln was, quote, unconscious of being moved with any aggressive spirit toward the South, unquote. Yet he wrote in that letter, quote, no peaceful extinction of slavery is in prospect for us. It's a signal failure of Henry Clay, he says. That spirit which desired the peaceful extinction of slavery has itself become extinct. The South has shown as much. That's what he felt in Robertson's letter. I don't know if he ever said this anywhere else. I've not seen it. But as a son of a shrink, even though it's only one time, perhaps, that can be the only time he ever truly unveiled his real thoughts. So when it came, he was ready for the war to come.
Right.
And so during this whole time in your book with Villard, he's obfuscating on something, but does he, you think, underneath, unconsciously, if not consciously, feel that there's probably no way out? If there's a spark, there's just no way out, and we're going to do it now and not kick this can down the road anymore?
I do believe that. That's a very revealing letter, because Lincoln hoped that the upper southern states, the border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, had such opportunity. They didn't have huge slave populations, and they weren't so heavily dependent upon slave labor for their economic well-being as the deep southern states, and that they could be persuaded rationally to abandon slavery if there were compensation, gradualism, and colonization. But when Henry Clay, of all people, was unable in Kentucky to get them to adopt any kind of emancipation, if it isn't going to work in Kentucky, when you've got somebody with the clout of Henry Clay on your side, then there's really no hope for peaceful solution to the slavery problem. And so I think during the secession crisis, that was very much on his mind, and that if he were to draw a line in the sand, as he did, and say, look, no compromise on slavery expansion. We can compromise on personal liberty laws and fugitive slave laws, and we can compromise on having a constitutional convention, a new one, and all that, but we can't compromise on the basic issue of slavery expansion. Even if it means war. I know he doesn't say that, but I'm pretty sure that was in the back of his mind based on the Robertson letter.
Glenn from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, thank you for your question, which we just answered. He asks, Glenn does, James Oakes has recently argued that Republicans, including Lincoln, came into office fully intending ahead of time to use the war as a means of achieving emancipation. I don't think they fully intended to, but they were ready to do it, and that's what that letter says and what you're saying.
Right, and that's what Oakes. James Oakes' books is, I think, one of the most significant books to come out about Lincoln and slavery in the past generation, called Freedom National. And one of the things he points out in that book, which is so revolutionary, is that the Lincoln administration starts emancipating slaves systematically in August 6th, 1861, with the first Confiscation Act. Now, the Confiscation Act was very narrowly defined. It said only those slaves who come to our lines, who say that they've been working on fortifications and the like, can be liberated. But when the Lincoln administration then sends out directives to the generals in the field, they say basically, any slave who comes to our lines, you accept. Because what are you going to do? You say, you've been working on fortifications, can you prove it? Do you have a video? You know, things like that. Right? Of course not. And then what if they show up with wives and children? What are you supposed to say? You can come in, but your wife and children can't? No, so everybody come in. So tens of thousands were freed before the Emancipation Proclamation, which is here in my tie with a little lunch, I see, before that was issued. And so the Republicans really take advantage of this first Confiscation Act, or the Lincoln administration does anyway, to really start a systematic emancipation in August of 1861. So the common thought is slavery and emancipation doesn't really begin until January 1st, 1863. Not at all. The war was it barely started. This was right on the heels of the defeated First Bull Run. So that's a tremendous book. I commend that to the attention of everybody who's interested.
And Robertson's letter as well.
Absolutely.
So we're coming to an end, and I need to let you know that Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world, will have other broadcasts coming up. I guess tomorrow, Lit with Love, which is our romance show, will have Catherine Ashe with her new romance title, The Prince. And Catherine will be here tomorrow, Saturday, at 11 a.m. Central Time, here in our broadcast studio in Chicago. That's 11 a.m. Central tomorrow. Lady Bird and Friends, our children's show with host Betsy Bird, will host Chris Rylander and a new epic adventure series for middle grade readers called The Legend of Greg. It's book 1 in the Failure series. I don't know what that is, but it sounds interesting. I'll have to look it up. And that's going to be June 12th at 5:30 p.m. Central Time. That's Lit with Love. You can see all these on authorsvoice.net. If you go to that, if you're on Facebook Live, you can go there and see all our future shows coming up. Our mystery show, Solved, will have author Victoria Thompson and, of course, our host, Libby Hellman, discussing her new thriller, Murder on Union Square. And that's Thursday, June 14th at noon Central Time. Again, look it up and you'll see, if you're forgetting this, go and find it out. You can ask questions while we're live, as you've seen today, and you can order a signed copy of today's book and those coming up at authorsvoice.net. This is a book that you're going to want to read. You can hear the author and how well he describes Villard and the book itself, and it's even more exciting than that, because you're going to find yourself going through, like the people of the day, going into a fog, not knowing what the next day will come, but Villard gives a dispatch on that next day. And if you're watching this on YouTube, after the broadcast, you can still order books. Follow the link under the title. So, SIU Press, thank you for sending Michael Burlingame to us with his latest book, 16th President-in-Waiting. No, let's not get to the 17th. No, the 16th President-in-Waiting, Abraham Lincoln and the Springfield Dispatches of Henry Villard, 1860-1861. Terrific book, and you can still get signed copies right now. So, thank you to the staff of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and Author's Voice, and appreciate very much that you've joined us today. And Michael, thank you again. We'll wait for your next book, and we'll keep the seat warm for you with many other authors as well.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you for watching.